Unit B lesson is going to focus on the Second World War, the global connections and problems from Versailles that facilitated it, and also the lasting effects, including America emerging as the most powerful nation in the world, as well as Cold War tensions. In the wake of the First World War, turmoil and the problems caused by a Great Depression throughout the world, nationalism and totalitarianism was on the rise throughout. Fascism in some areas, communist in others, but both used force and terror to intimidate and destroy their political opponents. Mussolini in Italy rose to power with his army of black shirts. He was able to take over the country with armed fascists and keep power until he was defeated and murdered. In Japan, the emperor and military leader were united in the hopes of establishing a Japanese empire. And in the Soviet Union, during the midst of World War I, when Lenin withdrew from the conflict, he was hoping to establish a communist state that would eventually also be able to take over the world. He took control of banking, of industry. He commercialized agriculture. And his actions directly led to famine and death of millions of his citizens. When Lenin dies in 1924, he does so without a successor. The presumed heir was Trotsky. He was beat by Stalin for a couple of reasons. First of all, Stalin had a way of relating Marxist teachings to the Soviet realities of the 20s that people really responded to, but he also believed that he could set up a socialist state without necessarily taking over the world initially, which was attractive to many Russians. And finally, in Germany, after the harsh peace established at Versailles and the pains of the war guilt clause, Germany was angry and frustrated. In addition to that, Germany, under the Weimar Republic, which was set up after World War I, had extensive economic problems. Inflation was out of control, and money was largely worthless. This all led Germans to turn to the powerful leadership of Adolf Hitler. Hitler ran for president, however, he didn't win. The amount of support the Nazi Party got did lead President Hindenburg to give him power for a brief time in something known as the Enabling Act. Hitler said that he intended to have dictatorial power only for 4 years to right Germany, right the German ship, as it were, and then he would return power. Of course, we know that is not true. A huge facet of Hitler's Nazism was the danger of communism, the decadent culture that had emerged, especially in the United States in the 20s, and the negative influence of the Jews made government weak and powerless to do anything, and these were the things that he focused on in making his case to the German people. There are many causes for World War II that we've already discussed. The Treaty of Versailles left a power vacuum in Germany that would be dangerous. The lack of peace guarantees after World War I, because America refused to ratify the treaty and join the League of Nations, meant that there was no body in the world that could maintain peace. The economic problems of the Great Depression, and finally, the emergence of violent nationalism and fascism throughout Europe. Hitler moved towards war gradually. He began by seizing what was formerly German or Prussian territory, and then gradually increases to seizing countries that have never belonged to Germany or Prussia in any way. Along the way, European leaders, led by Prime Minister of Britain Neville Chamberlain, worked to appease Hitler, asking him to stop, demanding that he not take any more land, but then failing to follow through when he did it. Overall, the world wanted to avoid war with Hitler. Hitler, however, refused to stop. And as a result, we get the ideology of appeasement. Take a look at this cartoon. It's a perfect example of appeasement. Nazi dragons being offered a lollipop. But when the lollipops are gone, the dragon's going to eat you. And so it was very clear that World War I had just ended. People were fearful of another global conflict. And so they understood that if they go to war with Hitler, it was going to drag the world into war, and Europe was hoping, and the world was hoping, to avoid that. We were committed to neutrality, more so even than in World War I. We, this time, refused to work with Hitler. Americans passed neutrality acts that required America to stay out of business with warring nations. After Chamberlain is ousted in Britain, Winston Churchill takes over. He will develop a very close friendship with Franklin Roosevelt, but the most significant thing Churchill does initially is to convince FDR to break with neutrality and institute the Lend-Lease program. The Lend-Lease program allowed us to lend money to Britain and lease them equipment. So by October, with American help, Britain is beating Germany 3-1 in the air. By the summer of 1941, Nazis control most of Europe. You can see here that there is either German occupation or a German dependent or friendly government instituted in almost all of Europe. America is not drawn into the fight with Germany until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese knew they could not defeat the United States in a long war. They hoped for one swift attack on the Pacific Fleet in order to cripple the United States before they started. So on December 7th, 1941, Japan launched a kamikaze attack on Pearl Harbor. 2,400 servicemen were killed, 8 battleships sunk, and 11 other ships. But there were many ways in which this attack did not succeed. Aircraft carriers were out at sea. The bombers ignored the maintenance facility where there were things stored to help the crippled aircraft. The intent to try to end the war quickly through Pearl Harbor was a spectacular miscalculation because it united Americans in a battle cry for war. When we gear up for Total War 2.0, everyone is involved in the war effort. By 1945, U.S. factories ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, produced 300,000 warplanes, 89,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, and 7 million rifles. The amount of production in the United States devoted to the war effort was formidable. People sold war bonds, bought war bonds. The military needed food, clothes, and weapons. They had victory gardens. Everyone was committed to winning so that the soldiers could focus on the battle at hand. The battle in the Atlantic Ocean was difficult because of German U-boats. Much like in World War I, the German submarine was deadly and had the option to destroy the American fleet. And Hitler had designed a program called Enigma that would allow him to communicate with his submarines each day in order to give them orders. Britain and Russian scientists crack the Enigma program figure out the code so that they can figure out where attacks are going to be, but then they have to be very careful in using it. They had to make sure they acted in such a way that Hitler was unaware that they cracked the code, because he would have changed it. So the battle for Atlantic was dramatically changed once we solved Enigma. Another major shift with America's entrance to the war became a strategic bombing of Europe. Air campaigns began working round the clock to attack not only German military targets, but German civilians. It was the hope that this would break the German morale and force Hitler into some form of settlement. The Second Western Front came on June 6, 1944, the greatest naval invasion in military history. Operation Overlord, the Battle of Normandy. Allies storm the beaches and are able to make it all the way to Paris. By August, over 100 days, 2 million men push Germans back and turn the tide of the war, which will lead to the liberation of Paris and VE Day shortly thereafter. Hitler's last stand in the East is in the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, he is fighting desperately against Soviet forces. Soviets cross into Berlin. After a 10-day battle, Hitler marries his mistress and then kills himself. The war in Europe is over. Though Hitler is defeated, the war in the Pacific is going badly for the Americans. For a variety of reasons, the American Marines are struggling to eke out a victory in the Pacific. American officials estimate that even with Hitler defeated and all of their concentration on Japan, that it was expected to cost 1 million American lives to invade. As a result, Harry Truman opts to use the atom bomb. The Manhattan Project was a secret program that Truman didn't even know about until FDR died and he became president. There were nuclear technologies that had developed the most deadly bomb ever seen in the world at that time. The blast radius would be 3,000 or more yards, not to mention the after effects of disease and radiation. On July 26, Allies demand Japan surrender. They refuse, and so on August 6th and 9th, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the 14th, Japan surrendered. Japan surrendered after the second bomb, not knowing we had no more developed at the time. Even though more Japanese died in the original fire bombings of Japan, the sheer horror with instantaneous evisceration that occurs with the atom bomb transforms the attitude of the world regarding warfare for years to come. The aftermath of the war is devastating. 50 million dead, 30 million displaced. Many cities were destroyed in Europe. Displaced persons roamed throughout Europe. Germany will be divided among the four allies, though the USSR will be at odds with Britain, France, and America for the next 50 years. Stalin and Hitler, similar in many ways, end up on different sides of history, largely because Stalin agrees to help the Allies. History remembers them very differently, though many of their ideas and tactics were the same. As a result of Stalin's alliance with the Allied powers, the Soviet Union will survive well into the 80s and continue to cause conflict and tension throughout the world long after Hitler has been defeated. World War II remembers these men very differently because of the choices that Allies made in the aftermath of the war. World War II transformed the view of the world regarding war. It transformed America into the modern superpower that it is today. And most importantly, it helped solidify Stalin's influence over the world that would continue, and sowed the seeds for the Cold War that would be the imminent conflict of the modern era.